Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Minnesota Artist Exhibition Program's Virtual Artist Talk with artist Leslie Barlow. We're so glad that you can join us today. My name is Anissa Antar. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I am the activation specialist at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I'm joining today from Bideota Otunwe, which is Mini Lake City in Dakota, or so-called Minneapolis. Please feel free to say hello in the chat and say where you are calling from. And if you don't know whose Indigenous territory you are on, where you are sitting, I invite you to look up where you are on nativeland.ca, and I'll post that link in the chat so that you can do that research. This talk would not be possible without the generous support of Ameriprise Financial, and MAEP would also not be possible without the support of the McKnight Foundation, RBC Wealth Management, and other additional anonymous donors. Before we get started with the talk, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please use either the chat or the Q&A to ask questions. The chat can also be used if you make sure that you select that the chat goes to everyone, can be used to, give some affirmations, participate a little bit more, and it can also be to ask questions for the Q&A that we'll have at the end of the talk. There's a live transcript that will be providing the closed captioning this evening. And if you have any questions or technical issues, you can go ahead and private message either myself, Anissa Antar, or the Minneapolis Institute of Art name, and we will definitely get to your question if you have a technical issue or other thing. And yeah, without further ado, it is my absolute honor to introduce you to Keisha Williams, who is my dearest colleague. She's the curatorial department assistant and artist liaison in global contemporary art at MIA, and she's also an incredible independent curator. And she'll take it away and introduce our illustrious guest this evening.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. As Anissa said, my name is Keisha Williams. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you all for being here. So thank you for joining us tonight. This talk is part of the Minnesota Artists Exhibition Program, or as we call it at MIA, MAEP. MAEP was founded in 1975 as a way for artists to engage with the institution directly. Throughout that time, it's taken on many forms and shapes, but we still maintain an open application process that is by juried peers for peers, so artists supporting artists. Our next open call will be closing Friday, October 29th. If you're interested in applying or learning more about the program, you can go to the artsmia.org/MAEP website, or just simply go to the ArtsMia website and search Minnesota Artist Exhibition Program, and you'll find the link. So I want to start us off today, before I introduce our amazing speakers, with a little bit of a grounding statement. I think we're all here for a very specific reason, and that's the space that Leslie has created within her exhibition, this feeling of community. So I just want to start by saying, in this conversation, we want to honor the spirit of Leslie's exhibition by affirming that this is a space free of tokenization and exploitation of mixed people and transracial and transnational adoptees. We'll be having a candid conversation about identity and the beauty, complexity, and nuance of mixed people. However, this is in no way the full picture, as we all experience different realities. An amazing collection of resources can be found within the exhibition itself. If you are able to go in person, I highly recommend taking a look at the resource library. And further resources can also be found on the Midwest Mixed website. So just briefly, a little introduction to the show. If you haven't had the chance to see it, I highly recommend it. Leslie Barlow's MAEP exhibition, titled Within, Between, and Beyond, explores representation, race, family, and belonging. Comprised of both paintings and video interviews, the work shares stories of 16 Minnesotans who use the terms mixed race, multiracial, and or transnational or transracial adoptees to identify themselves and their lived experiences. Within, Between, and Beyond invites us to hold space for, recognize, and consider our presumptions about race in Minnesota. So now I have the pleasure of introducing both Leslie Barlow and Lola Osunkoya. Leslie Barlow is a visual artist and educator living and working in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In her visual art practice, Barlow's current work uses figurative oil painting to share stories that explore the politics of representation, identity, otherness, and race. Barlow is an instructor at the University of Minnesota, is part of the organizing team at Midwest Mixed, a member of the mural collective Creatives After Curfew, and she also supports emerging artists as the director of Public Functionary Studios and Studio 400. Barlow is a current Jerome Hill Artist Fellow and McKnight Visual Artist Fellow. A very busy person. Lola Osincoya is a licensed psychotherapist and owner of the counseling practice Neither / Both LLC. Lola has created and facilitated racial identity-based content for local and national education, media, and community platforms. As an emerging artist, Lola uses writing and multimedia art to explore themes of identity, bringing theoretical concepts about race to mainstream art and conversations. Healing from damaging impact of racism is a central theme of her work. So without further ado, I would love to pass it on to Leslie.
Thank you so much, Keisha. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Leslie, and I use she, her pronouns. I am Zooming from Badeo Taotunwe, Minnesota Makoche, which is Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a Black mixed race woman with light brown skin. I have shoulder length, light purple, grayish hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt and earrings. I just want to take a few minutes to kind of introduce my work and give a little bit of a background on myself. And I just want to also state that talking about my work, because it's rooted and grows so much from such a personal place, never gets easier no matter how many times I do this. And I sometimes get stage fright. So just throwing that out there, when I name it, it feels better. I am also going to just remind myself throughout this hour that the reason we're all here tonight is because something in the work of Within, Between, and Beyond moved us. And I think that's what's going to give me strength as I keep going. I'm so moved by the topics and the content of this show that I've actually dedicated about 5 years of my life to it, constantly searching, questioning, and painting about this subject matter. And you'd think by that point I'd be some sort of expert on it. And yes, I do know some things. I've definitely unpacked and researched and thought deeply about the intimacies of race and racism and the power of representation and vulnerability. But then, something will smack me in the face, or somebody will share something new with me about their own navigations of mixedness. And then I'm like, wow, I don't know anything at all, right? There's so many layers to this work, and there's so many layers to these stories. And actually that's why I love this show so much, is because it allows for these multi-layered stories to come together in one space. So a little bit of background on myself. I was born here in South Minneapolis, central Powderhorn Park neighborhood. And I grew up going to Minneapolis public schools. My parents moved here from Chicago. My dad, or that's where they met, as teachers in Chicago. My dad grew up in Chicago, and our family roots on my dad's side through my grandmother can be traced back to Tennessee, where my ancestors were enslaved. And through DNA testing, I'm told that I'm descended from people living in modern day Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon. And then on my mom's side, she grew up in the Twin Cities area, and her mother immigrated to the United States in the 40s from Denmark. And my mom's father is of English and Irish descent. So I've been painting for the last decade, I would say, quote unquote, professionally, and working sometimes up to 4 jobs to feed my art habit. And I've always loved art. I was always a daydreamer as a kid, doodling in sketchbooks. And that was kind of my way to just be myself and process my surroundings. Looking back at, how my art kind of shifted, there was this big pivot in 2014, not just in art, but in my life, where I started graduate school at MCAD, and I was introduced to Owen Duckworth, and that was through an arts conference, and Alyssa Paris, I met her at a Black Lives Matter protest, and they both told me that they were gonna start these community dialogues, and would I be interested in joining? And these dialogues were gonna be about race and identity, and only mixed folks and adoptees were gonna be there. And I was like, what is that? I've never experienced anything like that. And that's the reality. That first meeting that I had with Owen and Alyssa and a number of other people was the first time that I had been in a space with mixed people like that. And people don't realize often, you're isolated a lot of mixed folks are isolated within their kind of identity experiences because there's not a lot of people to connect with on that. And there's not a lot of dialogue. At least at that time, there wasn't a lot of dialogue around mixed race identity that I was a part of. And even sometimes within your own family, you're isolated in your own experiences. You don't reflect the experiences of your mother or your father, or sometimes even your siblings. So in 2014, when I got to connect with these folks, that really changed the trajectory of my own identity path, but also the work. And then those dialogues grew into something called Midwest Mixed, which is now an organization. And just a really quick background about Midwest Mixed, since now I am a regular participant and leader in that organization. Midwest Mixed centers Black, Indigenous, people of color of all skin tones and across the gender and sexuality spectrum who identify as or connect to the experiences of being mixed race, multiracial, biracial, multi-ethnic, or as transracial and transnational adoptees. We also hold space for interracial couples and multiracial mixed families, and we use dialogue and alternative education and artistic exploration or artistic expression to support mixed people and transracial adoptees of color to learn through an intersectional framework, heal racial trauma, and build community solidarity in the struggle for equity and justice. I wanted to name that because With In Between Beyond actually is a part of, or the origin story of With In Between and Beyond really does come from Midwest Mixed. A few of us, a part of the leadership team, went to Baltimore in 2018. We took a trip to go to the Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference, a national conference. And that was the first time that I actually really got to connect with Lola Osunkoya. We had a really, really amazing conversation that first night in Baltimore, and I got to really, I guess, just get to know her and her story. She has such a calm, warm, sorry, I'm about to embarrass you a little bit, such a calm, warm spirit, but she's also super goofy and intelligent and just a badass mix, an amazing person. And what really struck me about my conversations with Lola was how fiercely she advocated for taking up space, the appropriate amount of space. And she made me want to be better and more confident in who I was and what I was creating. And it was conversations with Lola and also Alyssa and Sophia, who were on that trip, where we started talking about building a mixed race archive of stories. And wouldn't that be amazing to have this archive where we could see our story, by us, for us, represented just accessibly, whether it was online or physically in the world. So that's where it started, but we'll get more into that a little bit later. I also wanted to really quick set some kind of groundwork for just talking about mixedness. And so I would like to take a moment to read my statement that I wrote for the show. It's called A Letter to the Visitors. And then just to kind of untangle some of this language that we're going to be using. So I will do that now. Okay. We have been set up to fail in conversations about race. For our weary minds, hearts, and bodies, I do wish it was easier to dismantle the boxes constructed around us and to heal. It is a precarious and vulnerable thing to make artwork and tell stories about something that you're intimately connected to and still growing through. Some parts of the show bring me to the shakiness, isolation, and embarrassment felt in my youth, while other parts of the show ripple with resilience and imbue me with hope for a future rooted in understanding, connection, and liberation. I invite you to embrace and be embraced by the humanness of the stories and images shared in this exhibition, and acknowledge the questions and contradictions that arise. Identity formation. We need to decolonize or understand our understanding of race and identity while simultaneously holding the very real racialized experiences in our own lives and the lives of others. I argue this is critical to ending racial trauma, anti-Blackness, and systemic racism, and key to making space for mixed race people to live authentic, visible, whole lives within all of their identities. Still, with every answer I may offer, I have twice as many questions. With whether mixed race identity, consciousness, and organizing will seriously subvert or merely reinforce racial hierarchy remains a very open question. And what does mixed race mean in the United States in 2021? Many different things for different people. I problematize the words mixed race, knowing that everyone in our community identifies with this term and that it carries historical assumptions. Our culture and racial categorization system, born in white supremacy, leaves little room for complex multiracial representation and non-binary language. I use mixed as a socially constructed umbrella term to include differently racialized parentage, that an individual identifies as and or is socially designated as mixed race, and has the lived experience of reconciling multiple cultural influences. Transnational and transracial adoptees, people adopted by families of different national and racial identity than their own, often also navigate complex layers of erasure and identity policing that merge with the mixed race umbrella. These aforementioned experiences are not exclusive to mixed race people and transracial or transnational adoptees, but often overlap with the experiences of many communities of color. It took me a long time to write that, so I also just wanted to read it because of that. I'm very proud of that statement. And also Lola helped me edit it, so I want to just name that as well. What am I hoping to gain from the space and conversation today? So what I'm hoping to gain is that I want to reveal more about the process behind the work. I want to take this time and this moment to celebrate publicly what Lola and Ryan and myself created with everybody on this call. And I also really want to hear everyone who's here, your thoughts about how the work made you feel and what it brought up for you.
And Lola, do you want to just briefly tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Lola Osunkoya. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as mixed and Black. I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. My ethnic background, my mom is a white woman from Minnesota, Scandinavian background, Swedish, Norwegian, German. And my dad is Nigerian, was Nigerian. They met at the U as students, fell in love, and my dad was picked up by the INS. Today would be ICE, and deported to Nigeria before I was born. So he was not in my life growing up for reasons beyond his control. I do want to apologize to everyone too. I live right near a train, so you're going to hear some train sounds. I hope it's soothing rather than interrupting. So I grew up in a white family in South Minneapolis in the 80s. And my entire family was white, and my mom had a multicultural circle, but I didn't have anyone that I felt like was for me to confide in the racialized experiences I had as a kid without words. And that continued into my adulthood. So race has always been on my mind. I thought I was unusually obsessed with it because I didn't have anyone validating my experience. Until I got to college and therapy. So those two things kind of changed things for me. And by college took me 14 years. So this was like late 20s. I started finding books and theory on mixed race, and I was just shocked that other people were thinking this hard about race. So that was validating. I took every opportunity I could to study, and I also struggled with depression, and later realized there was trauma as part of this. So I went to therapy with multiple therapists, white women, Asian women, a white man with transracially adopted kids. None of them, well, I don't want to disrespect one of them, but it was very rare to have a therapist address race with me as related to my mental health. And I always felt if we could address race, that could really get to the core issue of what was happening and what was reinforcing depression. So I decided to become a therapist after many years and some soul searching, because I wanted to be able to offer that experience in therapy. And I really also wanted to find community. So like Leslie, growing up in South Minneapolis, I looked around and I saw that, and I was reading statistics, we have like the highest multiracial population or birth rate in the country, at least at one time. And none of us are talking to each other. So I was working at African American Family Services and happened to be on assignment with Jared Hanks, who told me there were these mixed race dialogues happening via Alyssa. So he wanted me to meet Alyssa. I met her and started with Midwest Mixed in about 2016, I believe. And that was life-changing, to be able to be in a room with people and have open conversations, and for the space to feel like it's for you and you're not doing something wrong by taking up space to talk about your experiences, is huge. And we developed language together, we shared common experiences, we healed, we grew, and it helped me personally and it helped me as a therapist. So in 2017, I developed Neither Both LLC. I actually started blogging under that name and had set up a website many years earlier, but I finally bit the bullet and tried to see if this was a real thing. I didn't know if people would come if I said I wanted to hold space in therapy for racialized trauma and for specifically people who identify as mixed race, multiracial, transracial, or transnational adoptees, and queer and trans people of color. Just basically holding space for complex identities, and people came. So I'm very proud of my practice. I'm proud of the people that I can help, and I'm super proud of this project. Leslie explained kind of how it came together, and it's just been a real joy and fulfillment to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Lola. I'll just say it's amazing to share space with both of you. And as a mixed race Black woman myself with a white mother and Black father, I recognize all that beauty, joy, confusion, sometimes pain that goes into the identities. So I'm really happy that we have this moment to start talking about Within, Between, and Beyond, but also just have a conversation with some really amazing mixed women to talk about our experiences in the world and finally take up some space. Because I think it's time to do that, to share our experiences. So I'd really like to start with both of you thinking about, how that collaborative space emerged and why it was so important, Leslie, for you to not tell other people's stories by yourself. What was the reason for collaboration? And then Lola, really, what role did you play in that? And what was the benefit of being a psychotherapist, entering that space that you really worked to foster that community, foster that truth telling that maybe many people, especially on this large of a scale, a nationally and internationally recognized art museum, I'd love to hear about that process.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I feel like I could talk about in regards to entering this project as a collaboration and wanting to share multiple voices and stories. But I guess I could just say that when thinking about building an archive of stories, those initial kind of conversation seeds that were planted in 2018, it was really about it wasn't about us personally. You know, it was about creating space to disrupt this idea of a single story or one kind of mixed experience, especially combating that idea that mixed means a black-white binary. Of course, you know, the three of us, the four of, you know, we're here and that story resonates with us, right? But that's not always the story, and often not the story. And even with the three of us, you know, the way we grew up, how we navigated understanding ourselves and our identities is very different. And so that was really the impetus for the project. But I also personally have always been fascinated with the power of portraiture and portrait painting, and thinking about who are these people behind these portraits that I just love and look at and study from artists that I really enjoy, and wanting to know what's behind the artist's gaze, right? So oftentimes when we're in space and we're looking at painting, we have the artist's voice and representation of that person, and then we kind of match that experience as the audience with our own interpretation or experiences or stories. And I thought that it would be really great to also have, you know, a third voice in that space, and that being the person actually in the portrait. And so kind of bringing paintings and videos together allowed for that kind of changing up of that silent portrait subject that we're used to. Yeah, and also through Midwest Mixed and getting to know so many different folks in community, you know, whether it was in that work or just other work that I do in different art spaces. I mean, connecting with people is one of my favorite things. I guess that's probably a need. If you paint people all the time, you probably gotta like people a little bit. And I like people a lot. I find the way that we navigate our worlds very interesting, how we are in relationship with each other, how we make meaning of our lives and our identities and our stories. And so for me, it just was like a natural progression of the work to have the interviews and having that be a central part of the work. Yeah, a part of this project. And I was really excited to collaborate with others in the making of the work. So in those initial conversations, talking with Lola, talking with Alyssa, bringing Ryan on a little bit later to do the videography and the editing, the process was just so much richer because I got to always be in conversation with Lola as the work was progressing, right? We would be processing together. I would share images of the paintings in progress. Sometimes we would be so deeply moved by, I mean, all the interviews were moving, but some would really strike us in our hearts. And instead of like me just like, you know, navigating that on my own, like we would have phone calls and we would talk about these things. And it was so powerful to process in real time with others as it was being created, the show.
So like we've mentioned, this process, like the idea started early on, and it was always naturally like the idea that we would have people telling their stories, because the idea of, I think we were kind of fighting against a narrative that we saw in a lot of like the YouTube and social media stuff around mixed people at the time, where it was like, well, and throughout our lives, people tell stories about mixed people. People have ideas about what mixed people are doing and feeling and how they should identify and what privileges they have or how confused they might be. But you haven't seen a lot of people centering themselves and telling their own stories. So that was super important. My role was as the lead interviewer when we got to starting the interviews. So at the beginning, we had 4 at the first Midwest Mixed Conference in 2017. And that was, I mean, we definitely learned as we went. So what was happening was when we applied for some grants to get this work off the ground, we came up with like, we really want people to talk about a few common experiences amongst mixed people and adoptees. So we had some general themes, and then I wrote out some like fleshing out questions, and we sent them to our participants. So the very first interviews, the first 4, just people kind of knew what they wanted to talk about. And I sat there and like asked some follow-up questions. I think the benefit of me being a therapist is I create space for people to feel comfortable telling their stories. So I think that was the main benefit of having me as a therapist on the project. But yeah, they talked about what they wanted to talk about. And then as we expanded the project to the next 12, we learned as we went, like I said. So Leslie always, as part of her process, did some photos and interviewing and getting to know the subjects, but I asked if I could come along. And so we had initial conversations with each of the participants where they kind of just talked about the things that they might want to do. And then through that process, I took some notes and then formulated very few questions, like 2 or 3 questions for each participant to ask during our recorded interviews. And that turned out really well. We were in studio space. By this time, it was deep into the pandemic. We'll probably get to a little more of that later, but this was never supposed to happen during the pandemic, and it changed a lot. And frankly, I was remembering the other day, this project was one of the first things I did leaving my own quarantine, and I was scared. So I remember going to meet Lacey in a park, and we were all masked and in chairs, but we were doing it, and it was really healing, especially after the murder of George Floyd. Like, this process just took on a different meaning, but we will get to that a bit later.
Yeah, I also just wanted to share quick, gosh, you're taking me back to that time, which was just crazy. But yeah, it's important to name that this project really had 2 phases, like Lola said. And the first phase, we were kind of, I don't want to say like walking in the dark, but it really was a learning process. And it was intentionally so, because we always knew we wanted it to be a larger project, but we also wanted to make sure that we could work out some of those nuances and details with a smaller group of folks, and also share it with people before we, a smaller group of folks before we expanded it to a more public space. So that first series of interviews, while beautiful, I could we were, just the process was crazy. We showed them at the second Midwest Mix conference, and it was really great to get feedback in that moment in a group of folks who identify directly with the stories that were being shared, right? So 150 people who identify as mixed race or transracial adoptees. And once we received that feedback, we felt much more confident in moving forward. And I think Lola, like you being a part of the that initial meeting before we filmed, like just connecting with people while I took photographs, was so integral to the project, because it not only protected us from the video piece, right? Because it was emotional, obviously, filming these interviews, but it also, I think, kind of set the participants at ease, because they were having an unscripted, undocumented conversation with me and Lola in a place of their choosing, which was usually a place that was comfortable for them. And after that conversation, we then moved into video recording. And that whole process, just like the way we reshaped it, taught me so much about, just what it's like to be vulnerable, and then how to like as much as you can authentically capture that, those stories in that way.
So it sounds like there was a lot of work on both of your parts to find those areas of connection and solidarity and care for everyone that collaborated on this project. It wasn't just transactional exchange. I think, like, we've seen some interviews, some artists producing work about maybe even communities that they don't exist in themselves. Would you say that for you, fostering those elements of care, which I read so clearly in both the paintings and the interviews, was something that you had to work towards, or because you're part of the mixed community, did that come as a natural first thought when you started this process?
I think because I've been painting people for a long time now, or several years, I try to enter all of those relationships and interactions with care and respect. But I think, you know, this work, since it started back in 2014, like I already mentioned, there was this kind of simultaneous like discovery journey, both in my art and in my own identity. And so in that way, my work has, you know, it's simultaneously, it has two purposes, right? It's both healing myself and healing community. Like I really do see it as having this like dual, this beauty in this dual process. So yeah, I think care is definitely a big part of it, and we were nervous, like, or I guess I'll just speak for myself. Like leading up until the show opening, right? I was like, were we intentional enough? You know, like there was always this question about like how it was going to be perceived. Yeah, just because it's heart work, you know, it's deep heart work. And when you're so attached to the subject matter, it's not something that's airy or conceptual. It's really, it's deep, you know? So yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
I think care work was really at the forefront of my mind, especially after the first iteration showed at the conference, because I knew I had my own personal experience at the conference being involved, and I'm going to reroute. It was really, we asked people to do something super vulnerable and sometimes terrifying. And people, like for instance, in the first four, Carolina is one of our subjects. And when we recorded her, she had never spoken about her trip back to Chile to meet parents. I mean, she was fresh back from Chile. And so we captured her unprocessed. There are some people you can tell in the videos who have been thinking about this and reflecting and practicing speaking for a long time. And there's some people who are very fresh. We have several people who hadn't really talked about this before and who had a variety of feelings about it. We had people who needed to re-record because they wanted to stand in their own integrity and know that they gave the story that they wanted to give. And I mean, imagine, like, because I'm comfortable enough talking about my own identity after, you know, over a decade, maybe 2 decades of like thinking, writing, talking, sharing, being in a group. But that is some vulnerable stuff. It's like your insides, your heart, your family relationships are out there. And then like you create this thing, and for videos that took 30 to 45 minutes, we gave you a 7-minute excerpt. And so it was really on our minds to care for our subjects, participants. And part of what we did, we hosted a dinner when we chose everyone. When we had the 16, we hosted a dinner, I think like January, or was it January 2020?
February, like 3 weeks before the shutdown.
Yeah, so we tried to, because we wanted people to be able to connect, to talk to each other about the experience we were having, because Leslie and I wouldn't necessarily be available to go back and process individually with people. And then we had a follow-up at just the day before the show opened to the public to take people through and then have dinner and talk together. So we really wanted to foster a sense of community and being able to talk to each other about what a vulnerable experience that was.
So, you know, we've mentioned very briefly what's happened in the past, year and a half now, and how that's deeply impacted all of us in so many ways. And I don't think that we've quite been able to collectively process how a pandemic, how the murder of George Floyd, how this really severe uptick in anti-Asian hate, so many communities of color being impacted by COVID, suffering losses of our ancestors, so much has happened. So I want to acknowledge that. And how did that really change your process? Or was it really driving you to keep going, to capture these stories that were at this moment, maybe less told? That it seems to me that there was a drive to make sure that these stories were told in such meaningful ways. So I'd love to hear a bit about that.
I'll just start a little. It's not funny, but I have to laugh because Leslie is a very schedule oriented person, and we had to obviously change the schedule of this show like a million times, reschedule, not just the opening of the show, but the interviews themselves and the photo taking. So that was just a funny part, but there was nothing funny about what happened last year to all of us. And it really did change the show. We had a variety of questions just about people talking about their identities, but we decided at a certain point to ask, we added 2 questions that we allowed people to answer if they wanted to. One was around being in quarantine. Has this changed how you think about your racial identity? You don't have to perform your racial identity to anybody in public. And has that changed how you think about yourself? And then the other question is, how has this uprising in Minneapolis impacted you and your sense of racial identity? And for many of our participants, it was huge. One of my favorite moments of this project was Alex. We met with him outside of one of the Juxta spaces in early June or July? And as we sat and talked, we realized the 3 of us, none of us had been just with people who were mixed Black and white. And we realized this phenomenon of at that moment, after the murder and after the uprising, we were suddenly and unquestionably Black, both internally and as we were racialized by other people. There was a switch. And it was just really fascinating to be able to process that with 2 other people, and with Leslie and Alex both being artists in community, seeing how their races were used in many ways. I can let Leslie talk a bit more about that if she would like, but it changed the whole trajectory. It changed timelines, and it changed how we thought about it. It changed whether we felt we should be taking this kind of space. We didn't know what the world was going to look like when the show finally opened. It was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, echoing what Lola said, it really impacted the show so much, not just in timeline, but in how we wanted to approach conversations with folks. We were even more sensitive because everybody, I mean, if you think especially early on in the pandemic, a lot of folks were questioning who they were to the core, what am I doing here? What am I putting my time into? What does life even mean for me? I mean, I just remember there was just so much, there was a lot of fragileness, right? And so we did send a message to the participants just saying, hey, is this even the right time to dive into these topics? If you want to back out of the project, we totally understand. And everybody was like, no, I definitely want to stay in the project, which was reaffirming for me, but also, as we continued with the conversations, it totally made sense to us that this was the right time to have these conversations, that people were experiencing their different identities in a more heightened way, especially if you're Black, right? And speaking for myself, all types of folks reaching out to me at this time, that as if you talk to any Black artists, they will tell you it was insane the amount of attention you were getting. And as a mixed race Black artist, even though I prioritize my Black identity in all spaces, it was just like Alex had said, it was an interesting navigation, right? Not wanting to take up space because it was important to, but also still understanding that you're not supposed to take up all the space, right? So there was this constant negotiation of which spaces were the right spaces to speak up in and talk, and lead, and which spaces were the right spaces to give space for other folks to lead. And so, yeah, and at a time when you're grieving and like processing all of this traumatic stuff, and I at the time and for a lot of my life only lived a couple blocks away from what's now George Floyd Square, and so I was holding so much last summer and questioning if I could even produce the project, right? Like, not just working with the people that were collaborating and the participants that were sharing their stories, but like, could I emotionally handle moving through this? Did I even have the energy to paint? You know, y'all saw the paintings. There's 16 huge paintings in that show. And it was a labor. It was a labor that I did in a much shortened amount of time, because most of that summer I was out in the streets, or I was doing art activations and murals and holding space for people. So this show took a wildly different direction, but I'm really happy that we were persistent, and I'm really happy that we pursued it, because walking in that space now, it's I just feel it's incredibly important, and it does feel timely, and I'm really proud of the space we do get to take up there.
Thank you so much. So we do have time for a few questions. I know it can be an intimidating thing, and I think let's bring the spirit of Leslie's show. There are no wrong questions when we're talking about identity. So feel free to either use the Q&A box, type into the chat. Just briefly, I also just want to thank all of the collaborators that you both worked with for sharing their truths. And I think for the beautiful honesty and vulnerability, I'm truly inspired by all of them. So I just wanted to thank them as well.
Yes, much gratitude. All right, we have a couple of questions coming in. So first question, are all of the interviews available online someplace? And Leslie, I think you can speak to that. And I have a small thing to plug as well that's related to the videos.
Yeah, they're all available on the Midwest Mixed website. So the whole archive is there. So that's midwestmixed.com. And there is a QR code too, right in the exhibition. So if you're planning on making a visit back, you can, just scan that QR code.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll drop the link in the chat as well. Also want to plug an upcoming opportunity in October. On October 9th, there will be a film festival happening at MIA that will be showcasing the interviews, and along with other short films by different artists that are working within the intersections of film and identity. So stay tuned for that. Great question. We have another question. Just thank you for all your work on this exhibit, truly incredible. I'm curious, what is the response from participants now that their stories are available to the general public?
Yeah, I can share that it's been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, without going too deep into it, because I want to make sure we have space for a lot of the questions. Participants have shared that conversations have opened up with family members, that it's been scary but beautiful. And I shouldn't say just participants, but I've gotten a lot of messages from attendees, people who have gone to the show and shared that they've gone multiple times or really taken up space, sat in the couch with a book and just enjoyed being in the presence of all of these different stories and images, images that they haven't seen in a cultural institution like MIA before. And so, that's been really special to hear those kinds of stories. I'm genuinely surprised that I haven't gotten any negative DMs. I do want to name that, because that's a shift I've noticed in making work like this about race, racial identity over the last 6-7 years, is that early on I would get a lot of hate letters in my email, or even in like comment books at galleries, or just like things, just negative things. And yeah, not this time. And I think that means that there is a shift in consciousness, or just a shift in how people are approaching the conversation.
Yeah.
I would, if it's okay, I would love to answer Tamara's question, because we
Yeah,
did.
please. Before you do that though, I did also want to plug another event connected to the exhibition that actually there will be a dialogue with participants, some of the participants subjects that are painted also happening. It's a virtual conversation that's going to be on October 19th, and I dropped the link. So, and for those watching afterwards, be sure to check out Mia's website for that information as well. But yes, please answer. Yeah, you can continue with Tamara's question. And the person below as well had a similar question about process.
Dope. Yeah, I love talking about painting, and there's never enough time to do that. But I'm so happy that you plugged that conversation with the participants, because folks can hear directly from them, like how the process went and everything.
Yeah.
And I'm excited for that.
So this question, I'll read it out loud. Can you talk about the why or how of the choices you made with regard to mark making, drawing, collage, finished or unfinished, and how these decisions created your language for these portraits?
Yeah, the why and the how, I think it's so hard to like sum it up really quickly, but it's a process of making that I've been working with for a while, actually probably since maybe some of your classes, Tamara. Tamara is an old teacher of mine. But it's, I think one thing I really enjoy about painting is the layering of materials. And so what you see in my work when you're looking at it is you're seeing a process of time, right? So you're seeing early marks, sketches, the base layer, whether that's underpainting or wood, gesso, and then all of the marks made till the very end. And so I want that whole process, that journey, to be something that you can see simultaneously in the piece. But also when thinking about journey, and I'm painting, images of people, real people, and thinking about our own life journeys and our own pathways of like discovering and learning and shifting our identities and growing, is that's a never ending process. And so the paintings, I want some areas of the work to feel unresolved, or not even necessarily unresolved, but like there's just more of the story left to be told. So you're seeing a history of the painting, but you're also left with something. There could be something more, but that's not something that I want to fully paint in or decide. And so either the audience can kind of fill in that blank, or you can look at it as like there's still there's a future, right? And things may be still changing and processing and shifting. So that's kind of how I think about the layers of more finished areas versus more unfinished areas in the work. And same with the textiles, it kind of, again, adds to that abstraction, or trying to communicate some of that complexity when it comes to identity and identity formation, and our lived experiences. But also it's a way to just honor storytelling. So when thinking about the history of painting, when thinking about the history of tapestries and quilt making, and especially African-American quilts, and just the cultural legacy that these objects have just in our culture, in our communities, in our lives. I love merging those two kind of storytelling mediums to create a new story, to talk about a merging of histories and cultures and stories, particularly when talking about identity. So I find that like meshing the two, creating this new kind of hybrid language, echoes that, and creates a more multi-layered language for the experiences and the relationships that I'm representing.
So beautiful, Rich, and such care taken in the way, there's this care emanating from everything that, the way that you work, Leslie, so we appreciate that. Unfortunately, we really only have time for one more question. Thank you all to the beautiful questions in the Q&A. I wish we could get to all of them. I think Lola, if you would like to maybe talk a bit about, let's see, there are a couple of, I'm gonna kind of mix some questions together. Let's see. Any advice on how to get a group or space started for mixed race people to get together, and also any advice to for young people and other mixed, all ages, intergenerational, but there is a question specifically about youth, anything to get folks motivated, feeling that they can move into the world after a year of isolation. What is some advice on getting folks together in this time?
Well, unfortunately, I'm probably not the best person on these questions, but I will give it a go. Community building was one of the big struggles I had, even though I felt it was so important, which is why I was so glad I found Midwest Mixed. So Midwest Mixed is doing a lot of virtual things. So there are ways that you can get plugged in. We're doing dialogues. There's at least like 2 or 3 a month that are on Zoom right now. So that's one way to get plugged in. But my advice on starting a group would be to start small, start simple, and start with low expectations. When people are coming together for the first time, they're generally just happy to be around a group of mixed people. We learned a lot about that through trying to create different dialogues through Midwest Mixed. And like simple topics like, what was it like growing up in your family, will generate 2, 3, 4 hours of discussion with a group of people who've never had the opportunity to talk to others. It doesn't have to be anything big, but just use social media, use the internet, and just start small. And we're really lucky to be in a time where you can start on Zoom. In terms of encouraging young people, I guess I'll take that specifically in terms of being mixed. Don't decide anybody's racial identity for them. Really allow a lot of space for kids to explore and name their own identities. I think one of the most harmful group experiences I've heard that we have is like when other people try to tell you and dictate to you how you're supposed to identify and what that means. I guess what I would like to say is mixed and lots of complex identities can change over the course of the lifetime. I've identified a number of ways in my life. I sometimes identify differently based on different contexts. So at school, I might identify one way, with one side of the family, I might identify another way. And that's not fake. That's having a fluid sense of identity, which, mixed identity is complicated and complex. So it changes over time. It changes based on context. Some people choose to opt out of racial identity, and that's okay too. I think just allowing space and allowing experiences, and for parents, get involved in all of the communities that represent who your child is. Make sure they have children and other adults to talk to. If you can't do that in person right now, again, do it online. But you also need to have the relationships. Have doctors, providers, teachers that are of the same background as your children. And you make relationships as well. Go into community, explore yourself, model crossing community, crossing boundaries and things like that. Don't expect that you're going to, especially for white parents, don't expect that you're going to raise your kid in a white neighborhood and they're going to come out with a really great sense of identity. It's just not what's going to happen. Yeah, and honestly, we noticed during pandemic, so many mixed things popped up online. So there's a lot of resources if you can't have them in person in community right now. It really is at your fingertips. So I'll leave it at that.
A beautiful way to end. Thank you all so much. Thank you to this incredible powerhouse of a panel. I feel really grateful to be in community with you all and to share space. Thanks to our participants. It's been wonderful. The chat is absolutely it's so abundant. I'd love to read where folks are coming from, and just all of these comments and these questions are excellent. And any last final thoughts? Yeah, Keisha.
Within, Between, and Beyond is open until October 31st. So make sure if you are able to come see it in person. Also, there are amazing resources on the Midwest Mix website. If you have any other logistical questions about the exhibition, please feel free to reach out to me. And my name is Keisha Williams. You'll see my name on the information for the talk today. And my MIA address, you can just search my name online.
I'm just gonna say one more thing, just talk even longer. That, processing through art is beautiful, and having the visual representation at MIA is so important, but it's not everything. So I just wanna say that, making this work, having this conversation in this space, it's one part of a larger web of actions that lead us closer to an equal and just society, but that's in combination with other work. So if you're wanting to get involved, or the exhibition moved you and you're like, I wanna, whether you identify as BIPOC or mixed or transracial or transnational adoptee or not, there's a lot of ways that you can support communities like this. Voting in local and national elections is one. Spending your dollars in Black businesses is two. Supporting community with volunteering or mutual aid is three. If you're in a position of privilege, stepping back and offering space to your platform to someone else. And I could go on and on. There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved. So just putting that out there, that I feel so incredibly grateful to make this kind of work and to work with Lola and to have a platform like MIA. But at the end of the day, it's just one small piece of the puzzle. So that's it. That's my TED Talk, my MIA talk.
Well, thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Lola. Thank you, Anissa, for leading us through this. Thank you all for being here and sharing space with us. I hope you have a lovely rest of your night. Make sure and see Within, Between, and Beyond. Thank you.